For my entire life, I was nothing more than the other child. The one who didn't shine, the one who didn't matter. My sister, Claire, was the golden child, perfect, adored, untouchable. And me? No matter what I achieved, I was invisible. But the day she lost everything, something shifted. Suddenly, I was important. Suddenly, they needed me. But when I finally said no for the first time in my life, my entire family turned on me. What started as years of silent resentment would soon explode into a brutal confrontation, one that would change everything forever. Growing up, I learned one thing very quickly: I would never be enough. My older sister, Claire, was everything my parents ever wanted: beautiful, smart, and effortlessly charismatic. She was the straight-A student, the homecoming queen, the girl whose name was whispered with admiration by teachers and family friends. From the moment she was born, it was like the universe had placed a golden crown on her head. And then there was me. I wasn't a failure. I worked hard, I got good grades, I never got into trouble. But no matter what I did, it was like I was existing in a shadow too big to ever escape. When Claire got accepted into law school, my parents threw her a lavish celebration. When I got into college on a full scholarship, my mother barely looked up from her phone. When Claire brought home an expensive gift she bought with her first paycheck, my father beamed with pride. When I saved up for months to buy my own car, he shrugged. You should have waited. Claire got a better deal on hers. I spent years trying to prove myself. If I worked harder, if I achieved more, maybe they'd finally see me. Maybe I'd be worthy of the same love and admiration. But no matter how much I accomplished, no matter how much I sacrificed, it was never enough. The real breaking point came the night of my 25th birthday. I didn't expect much, I never did. But still, I hoped. Maybe this year, they'd remember. Maybe this year, they'd celebrate me. I was wrong. I walked into the house that evening to find the dining table decorated, wine glasses filled, and my entire family gathered in excitement. For Claire. She had announced her engagement that afternoon, and my birthday had become nothing more than an afterthought. My mother hugged me briefly before rushing back to Claire's side. My father raised his glass and said, "This is truly the happiest day for our family." They didn't even realize what they had done. I sat through the dinner in silence, barely touching my food, letting the weight of years of being overlooked settle in. And that was when I made a decision. I was done. I was done trying to win a race I was never even considered for. Done fighting for the scraps of attention they threw my way. Done chasing validation from people who had decided long ago that I wasn't enough. For the first time in my life, I accepted the truth. I would never be Claire. And for the first time, I didn't want to be. That night, after they toasted to her perfect future, I quietly left without saying goodbye. And none of them even noticed. Life has a strange way of flipping the script when you least expect it. For years, I had been nothing more than an afterthought, a shadow cast by my sister's brilliance, a name barely worth remembering in family conversations. But life doesn't play favorites forever. And one day, the golden child fell. It started with whispers Claire had lost her job. At first, my parents brushed it off, claiming it was just a temporary setback. She's too smart to be unemployed for long. But as the weeks stretched into months, reality began to settle in. Claire, the perfect daughter, was drowning. She had lived her entire life under the assumption that success was guaranteed, that she would always land on her feet because she had never known failure. But the world outside our family didn't treat her like royalty. The job market was ruthless. The bills piled up. The expensive lifestyle she had built crumbled faster than she could hold it together. And suddenly I became important. The same parents who had barely acknowledged my accomplishments were now calling me nonstop. My mother's voice dripped with forced sweetness. "Honey, you know Claire is struggling. She just needs a little help until she gets back on her feet." My father, usually indifferent, suddenly noticed me. "This is what family does. We take care of each other." Their words might have sounded convincing if I hadn't known the truth. This wasn't about family. This was about fixing Claire. They weren't reaching out to me. They were reaching out to my bank account. And the moment I realized that, something inside me snapped. I thought back to every achievement they had ignored, every moment I had begged for their approval. I thought about my birthday forgotten in favor of Claire's engagement. I thought about how in their eyes I had only become valuable the moment they needed something from me. For the first time in my life, I had the power. And I had a choice. I could say yes, like I always had, play the role of the good child, the supportive sibling, the one who was finally useful to them. Or I could do something I had never done before. I could say no. Now, before I share what happened next, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like the less important sibling? Have you ever been treated like an option until someone suddenly needed you? If you can relate, hit that like button and drop a comment below. And hey, if you love stories that challenge the idea of family loyalty, make sure to subscribe to Mr. HeartVibes for more. Because trust me, what happened next? They never saw it coming. Saying no should have been easy. 3 simple letters. 1 short word. But for someone like me, someone who had spent an entire lifetime trying to prove their worth to people who never truly saw them, it wasn't just a word. It was a declaration. A battle cry. The first real act of defiance in a war I hadn't even realized I was fighting. The first time my mother called, I hesitated. I told myself I needed time to think, that I'd get back to her. But deep down, I already knew my answer. The second time she called, I let it go to voicemail. By the third call, she wasn't asking anymore. We raised you, we supported you, and now when your sister needs help, you turn your back on us? I stared at my phone, reading the words over and over again. We raised you. It was almost funny. My parents had never supported me the way they had Claire. They had never invested in me, never celebrated my successes, never even pretended to care about the things I worked so hard for. And yet, the moment they needed something, they acted as if their love had been unconditional all along. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about family. This was about control. So I sent my response, clear and direct. I can't help. Claire will have to figure this out on her own. The silence didn't last long. An hour later, my father called. No more fake sweetness. No more pretending. His voice was sharp, cutting. This isn't just about Claire. This is about family. You don't turn your back on family. I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of my desk. I'm not turning my back on family, Dad. I'm just finally realizing that I was never really part of it. The silence on the other end was deafening. Then his voice dropped into something colder. You'll regret this. He hung up before I could say another word. But I didn't regret it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their approval. I wasn't begging to be seen. I was done. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages. Claire, who had always been so composed, had finally cracked. So this is who you are, huh? Jealous. Bitter. Selfish. After everything Mom and Dad did for you, this is how you repay them? Fine. Stay out of my life. I don't need you anyway. And just like that, the last string tying me to them snapped. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The silence should have been comforting. After years of being overlooked, ignored, and treated like an afterthought, I should have felt liberated knowing that I had finally walked away. But I knew better. People like my parents, like Claire, didn't just accept losing control. They didn't just let go. And I was right. It started small. Subtle attempts to lure me back in. My mother left voicemails dripping with forced concern. I don't know what's gotten into you, sweetheart. You're not yourself. Just call me back so we can talk. My father took a more direct approach. You think you're better than us now? You think money makes you untouchable? You'll see. One day you'll come crawling back. But I never responded. Then the manipulation escalated. Extended family members, relatives who had never cared enough to check in on me before, started reaching out. I don't know the full story, but your mom is really hurt. Claire's struggling. You really can't find it in your heart to help. Blood is blood. No matter what's happened, you only get one family. Each message was another desperate attempt to pull me back into the role they had designed for me. The reliable one. The responsible one. The useful one. But I wasn't playing their game anymore. So I did the one thing they never expected. I blocked them. Not just my parents. Not just Claire. Every single number that tried to guilt me back into submission. And with every block, the weight on my chest grew lighter. That was when the anger truly set in. The final text I ever received from Claire came 2 weeks later. You'll regret this. You'll be alone forever. She always had a way of making herself sound like the victim. As if I had abandoned her. As if she hadn't spent years being the one who mattered while I was nothing but an afterthought. As if my absence was some personal betrayal rather than me finally choosing myself for the first time in my life. But I didn't feel guilt. I felt something else. Relief. Because for the first time ever, my life was truly mine. Because for the first time in my life, I was free. The silence didn't last long. At first, I thought I had won. That by saying no, by refusing to be used, I had finally set myself free. But my family had spent years shaping me into someone who existed for their benefit. And people like them? They didn't just let go. They retaliated. It started with my mother. The first few days after I cut them off, I got voicemails dripping with fake concern. I don't know what's gotten into you, sweetheart. You're not yourself. Just call me back so we can talk. A pause. Then a sigh. You know we love you, right? I almost laughed. Love? Where was that love when I spent years trying to prove I was worth their attention? Where was that love when I sat at my own birthday dinner, invisible because Claire had made another big announcement? Love had never been unconditional in my family. It had always been transactional. And I wasn't buying into it anymore. So I ignored her. Then came my father. He wasn't the type to beg. Instead, his anger filled the gaps my mother left. You think you're better than us now? You think money makes you untouchable? You'll see. One day you'll come crawling back. Crawling back. As if I had ever relied on them. As if I hadn't spent my entire life pulling myself up alone while they poured all their love, all their resources, all their pride into Claire. As if I owed them something just for existing. I deleted the messages without responding. And then the real manipulation began. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly started reaching out. I don't know the full story, but your mom is really hurt. Claire's struggling. You really can't find it in your heart to help. Blood is blood. No matter what's happened, you only get one family. Each message was another desperate attempt to pull me back into their web. They weren't actually concerned about me. They had never been. They were just repeating the same script my parents had fed them, trying to guilt me, trying to make me doubt myself. It almost worked. For a brief second, I felt it. That old, familiar pull. The weight of obligation pressing against my chest. Then I remembered how quickly they had dismissed me when I had nothing to give. And just like that, the guilt disappeared. So I did the one thing they never expected. I blocked them. Not just my parents. Not just Claire. Every single number that tried to guilt-trip me back into submission. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends who had always acted like I barely existed. Gone. And with every block, the weight on my chest grew lighter. That was when their anger turned to pure desperation. Claire sent the last message I would ever receive from her 2 weeks later. You'll regret this. You'll be alone forever. I stared at the words, waiting for the sting. But it never came. Because I finally understood something. For years, they had convinced me that I was lucky to have them. That I needed them. That without them, I would be nothing. But the truth? They were the ones who needed me. Because I was the only one who ever gave. And now? They had lost that. So I took a deep breath. Then I deleted the message, blocked her number, and moved on. For the first time in my life, I didn't just walk away. I closed the door. And this time, I wasn't looking back. For the first time in my life, I had no one to answer to. No more phone calls demanding money. No more guilt-tripping texts. No more feeling like I was running a race I was never meant to win. And at first, the silence felt wrong. Not because I missed them, but because I had never truly experienced peace before. I had spent years bending over backward to earn love that was never unconditional. Now I was finally free. But with that freedom came the terrifying question. Who was I without them? I had spent my entire life orbiting around Claire, my parents, their expectations. I had measured my success not by my own happiness, but by whether or not they deemed it good enough. Now they were gone. And for the first time, I had to decide what I actually wanted. So I started small. I took myself out to dinner, not because I had to celebrate anyone else, but just because I could. I signed up for a photography class, something I had always wanted to do but had pushed aside because it wasn't practical. I went on a trip alone. I booked a flight to a city I had never been to, spent days walking unfamiliar streets, eating at places that no one had recommended to me because this time I wasn't living for anyone else. And slowly I started to realize something. I had spent so much of my life surviving, I had never actually learned how to live. But now I was learning. And then, just as I was settling into this new, quiet kind of happiness, they came back. It started with an email from my mother. Your father and I would really like to talk. I know you've been going through something, but we're still family. Let's not throw everything away over one mistake. I almost laughed. They still thought this was about one argument, one decision. They still didn't understand that this wasn't about Claire or money or a single moment of conflict. This was about years of being unseen. Years of being treated like I didn't matter until they needed something from me. And now they wanted to pretend none of it had happened. I didn't respond. The next message came from Claire. Mom and Dad are really upset. You've made your point, okay? It's time to stop being dramatic and come back to the family. There it was. That same entitled tone. That same belief that I was nothing more than an extension of their world. That I would always, eventually, fall back into place. But they didn't understand. There was nothing to come back to. So this time I didn't block them. I let the messages sit there, unread. Because the best revenge wasn't yelling, or fighting, or proving anything to them. The best revenge? Was living a life they never expected me to have. And I was finally free to live it. This story isn't just about walking away, it's about reclaiming your life. Too often, we're taught that family is something we must tolerate, no matter how much it hurts us. But real family isn't about control, guilt, or obligation. Real family is about respect, love, and mutual support. And sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is step away from the people who refuse to see your worth. Olivia's story is proof that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. That setting boundaries isn't an act of cruelty, but an act of self-respect. And that sometimes the best revenge isn't anger or confrontation, it's living a life they never expected you to have. So now, I want to hear from you. If you liked this story, comment 2. If you didn't, comment 7. Have you ever had to walk away from someone toxic in your life? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you love stories like this, hit that like button and subscribe to Mr.HeartVibes for more powerful stories that make you think, feel, and maybe even see things in a new light. Your support keeps these stories coming, and I truly appreciate every single one of you. See you in the next one.